Hey folks, quick one here today. I've been really interested in using the WoW model viewer to look at how dungeons are laid out and how the instanced and non-instanced versions compare and connect. And, I've been researching and discovering that the stuff you find in these classic models relates back to the way the game was designed in the early 2000s. And, Deadmines, by all accounts, was the very first dungeon designed and has some really cool history that really helped shape the entire game in terms of the way dungeons would work and be laid out and the way they would interact with the rest of the world. And because it's a lower level dungeon, many players have this as their first memory of an instance group, and it really seemed to showcase the perfect way to like cascade or build up as you went through the dungeon in terms of scope and size and story. You start off being led to this nondescript farmhouse here in Moonbrook by the Defias trader. You head in and you make your way upstairs and you end up going into the silo. You think the silo is going to be full of grain, but surprise, it's got a spiraling pathway heading down that leads you into the tunnels that would be the mines. And when we look at the model from the outside, you can see that there's a lot of twisting, turning mine tunnels that you would make your way through. And if you went over to the sort of what would be veering to the left, this point on the model, you get to an area of undead where you would collect miners cards for the quest collecting memories. And there's a badge that you want to get for Oh Brother. And I think that all the miners and enemies in here drop the red bandanas for another quest. But if you stay to the right, you head over toward where the instance is going to be. And you can always see on these models this little gray ring, which indicates where the instance portal would be. And you can see there's this big room sort of leading up to where you would enter the instance. And that's, of course, going to be what most folks are familiar with. And I'll actually clip into the model so we can see it. So you'd come to this spot. Most folks jump over this little railing here and you head right down and right through this archway is where you'd be into the instance. And if you could, again, the piece I like looking at, if you could somehow get past the instance portal and stay in this version of the model, the real world version, you would just drop off into space after you made that first left turn. And there's what it looks like from the outside. And it's pretty cool if you sort of take a mental snapshot of like this layout. This is where we just entered in, and you make the left-hand turn right here. And this is that big room where we jumped over the railing and we would have come down right in here. And of course, all of this is the area leading back to the farmhouse here. If we switch the model over to Deadmines Model B, we were in Model A, right away you get to the instance version, and it's crystal clear that that's what we're in because there is Van Cleef's big ship right there. But before we dive into that spot, let's go back to the beginning. So here we're at roughly the same orientation where I said to take a snapshot. Here's the same room where you would jump over, and here's the instance portal, this little gray circle here that we're looking at from the side. But of course, where we make that left-hand turn now is built out because it's the entire instance. But what I always like looking at is the fact that this entire room, the top here, is built out really only for the purpose of being able to look back through the instance portal once you've zoned in and see what you're supposed to see. The portal would be right here and you'd be looking right into that room where you came in. So I won't dwell on this in a lot of detail, but once you're in the instance, you make your way through the first set of sort of narrow tunnels, dealing with miners and enemies of increasing difficulty. There's casters that come up until you get to this first room, which is sort of this gray blob on the model here. And of course, it opens up. It's a bigger room, and inside is the first boss, Rhahk'zor, and he's called the foreman. So right away, you know this is a foreman of a construction site and stuff is being built. You head in further after killing that boss, make a right through this tunnel here. There's another door that you have to go through, and you end up in the next big room, the Mast room. And of course, in here is Sneed on his shredder. So right away, we know that they're working on logs and making something. And if you know that it's a mast, you know what they're building already, but more construction as the story sort of builds. We head through this next smaller area of narrow mining tunnels and then into the largest room that you've been in yet, again, as the whole thing sort of cascades and builds up, the Foundry. And right away we see there's a lot going on in here. They're pouring molten metal, and they're ultimately making cannonballs and cannons. And at that point, you realize what's going on and what they're probably building here. So you defeat Gilnid, who is called the Smelter, down at the bottom, and you make your way out of that room down at the bottom of the big foundry room. You make your way through the last set of tunnels. Again, if we've paid attention to the stories and the name of the bosses, we know it's going to be a big ship. And sure enough, you make your way through this door, and there it is, Van Cleef's huge ship. And it said that Chris Metzen really wanted this grand reveal of the amazing Ogre Juggernaut that will house the last 4 bosses and really sort of complete this part of the story. And of course, those are going to be Mr. Smite, who is, I think he's like the ship's co-captain or first mate. It will be Cookie, the cook, of course, Captain Greenskin, and then Van Cleef. So the first thing you notice with this model compared to virtually all the other dungeon models is that typically any environment that is inside, where you're not going to see a skybox texture or see the sky, would have had all the walls be part of the dungeon model. So this would normally be like in a big blob of gray rock, because we know that this ship is in a big cave that's aimed at a huge door. So why isn't that part of the model? Well, the answer is very interesting and ultimately shaped the way the entire dungeon aspect of the game is structured. So at Blizzard Museum here in Southern California is this concept art picture that shows the Juggernaut outside. And apparently Chris Metzen's idea for Deadmines was to have it end at this giant ship, again, a big reveal that was on the coast of Westfall. And as that was all coming together, apparently that was the first time it occurred to everyone that, hey, instances are separate from the rest of the world. And we're sort of going to be duplicating stuff here. And I'll bet players in Westfall are going to see this ship and want to go out there and explore it. And if you're in the dungeon on the ship, you're going to want to jump off and swim over to Westfall. So what do we do? And apparently there was quite a bit of debate about that until they finally realized, hey, we have to just more cleanly separate this dungeon from the world. So the entire thing was moved inside a cave behind a big door. And apparently the architecture and programming of dungeons at the time was designed around them being these small spaces. And when the Deadmines change was made, the guy Scott Harden, who was working on things for dungeons like view and render distance, had to fundamentally change all of that so that large spaces could be allowed inside dungeons, all because of this Deadmines room. So now you have the ship inside a cave facing a huge door, which led to further adjustments to Westfall so that when you exited, you came out of this little mine shaft where the ship would be behind you, say, and maybe facing toward your left, toward its big door. And when you look back, you can see the farmhouse that you entered, the entire mines and the dungeon, ultimately the cave with the ship, would be, story and lore-wise at least, inside all of these hills within Westfall. And if you spin around and head toward STV, sure enough, there is the giant door that Van Cleef would have had to open and sail through Goonies style. And it's actually even on the map file here that you can see when you look at the map files that I reviewed in my other videos. So interesting stuff, and just a bit more history. Later in development, Adam Byrne was animating dragons, and apparently he just blew everyone away with how epic the animation for dragons looked. So much so that they decided, well, this has got to be our first epic raid boss of the game, and it needs to be huge. And of course, because of the structural and functional changes to the way dungeons would work coming out of this Deadmines Juggernaut room, we have yet another epic-sized grand reveal in an instance that of course became like almost an initial finale to the first phase of the game. Of course you want to have a dragon be the thing you got to defeat at the top of endgame, at least when the game first launched. So, I love this dungeon for the fact that so many players have fond memories of it as their first dungeon and how it influenced the future of the game in terms of storytelling and progression through dungeons and in terms of how dungeons would interact with the real world and how they could look on the inside, which ended up rippling through the entire game and I think just making it all the more epic. So, hey, it wasn't my main focus here, but if you're interested in some of the historical tidbit stuff that I shared here, or just interested in how WoW came together during those early days of 1999 through 2004, there's no better source than John Statt's book, The World of Warcraft Diary, a journal of computer game development. And you can get that on Kindle Or as of right now, when I'm making this video in May of 2024, he's about to release a hardcover version that would be a really good gift for yourself or any longtime WoW player. And he also talks about quite a bit of that stuff in a really outstanding hour-long interview in a video that I'll link in the description, which I have no idea why it doesn't have more views because it's awesome. And by the way, I have absolutely nothing to do with any of that stuff, but I've read the book and I've watched the video and it's awesome. Again, I hope this was interesting, folks. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.